Now on Indianapolis This Week, showdowns in Congress over gun control, immigration, and the federal budget. Today, we talk with one of Indiana's newest members of Congress about those issues and more. Plus, down to the wire at the General Assembly and new pressure for a 10% cut in your taxes. Political insight on whether the cut could actually happen.
From RTV6, Indianapolis This Week.
And thank you for joining us for Indianapolis This Week. I'm Todd Connor. We start this morning talking about the top issues in the nation's capital and two stories that have received so much attention this week outside of Washington. And we are joined this week by Representative Luke Messer. He's serving his first term representing Indiana's 6th District in the U.S. House of Representatives. He has also served in the Indiana House of Representatives and as Executive Director of the State Republican Party. Congressman Messer, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Todd.
Appreciate you coming by for us.
Glad to be here. Yep.
Let's start by talking about those two stories. First, the terrorist attack in Boston. I know you spoke on the House floor this week about the tragedy. Your thoughts as you've watched the events unfold?
Well, you can't help but be heartbroken by the events that have occurred there, and your hearts and prayers go out to the families that have suffered. The events are unfolding almost by the minute, and you know, it's a reminder that we live in a very dangerous world, and as a nation we have to stay vigilant.
Is the government doing enough to protect Americans? I mean, is there more we can be doing and should be doing?
Well, I think if you go back to where we all were on the evening of September 11th, you know, more than a decade ago, it would have seemed unimaginable that we'd had as few attacks as we've had over the course of the last decade plus. I think that's a credit to the men and women who are working on our national security. I think it's not because the bad guys haven't been out there trying to do evil things. And it's a reminder that as safe as we've felt at times, that we have to stay vigilant and keep our resources focused. I do believe under the circumstances, the best I can tell, the administration has responded well, and they've done the kinds of things you'd like to see after this kind of attack.
I think after 9/11, everybody had this stereotypical image of what a terrorist is that wanted to attack the United States. And one of the big concerns, I know a long time ago, was that these, and many of our attackers were Muslim, that Muslims who now look like Americans would be the ones to attack us, and that's what we'd have to look out for. And it seems, it's still in the early stages, but it seems like some of that could be playing out, and there might be terrorists now living among us that are coming out.
Well, and again, the events are unfolding, and you want to be careful. We've gotten in trouble in the past when we've rushed to judgment, but it does appear now that these young men are Islamic and from Chechnya. Again, what we want to focus on is keeping people safe. Obviously, the events have been tragic in Boston. We want to make sure they don't spread elsewhere.
The other story, the ricin letters mailed to the president and a U.S. senator, FBI tests now confirm that it was in fact ricin that was on those letters or in those letters. Surprise you anything about those attacks that you know, this is happening now or ever for that matter?
Yeah, well, at this time it appears that they're just a coincidence that those incidents have happened at the same time as the explosions.
And in fact, a different suspect involved.
Absolutely,
well.
Absolutely. You know, specifically as to Congress and to the White House, over the last 10 years, the process by which this mail is processed is elaborate. And so as an office ourselves, we don't, those kinds of packages don't come to us without being x-rayed and the like. But it's just a reminder that we live in a dangerous world and you can't take anything for granted.
Do you yourself or your office take any extra steps other than what's recommended to you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you have to do is if a package shows up and it hasn't gone through the process, it's sad, but the truth is you can't open it until you have it go through the process because you never know what it would be.
Everyone's safety is at stake.
Well, that's my #1 responsibility in our office is to make sure our office stays safe.
Right.
And we're going to make sure and follow the procedures that makes that happen.
A big vote this week in the U.S. Senate where a plan to expand background checks on gun sales at gun shows and on the internet failed. A surprise to many, but yet you applauded the Senate vote after it was complete. Why not have background checks? What's wrong with that?
Well, we already have background checks. There's some real questions about whether those background checks are adequately
enforced. But not
enforced.
everything was covered.
Well, I mean, there are some loopholes around gun shows, but many of the purchases that happen in gun shows are checked. You know,
most are, as a matter of fact.
That's right, most are. But the 19 counties I represent, which stretches here from East Central to southeastern Indiana, are 19 counties where I can tell you the #1 issue we hear about in our office is the Second Amendment. Folks are concerned concerned that the president has tried to drive forward an agenda that takes the tragedies that happen in Connecticut and Missouri and elsewhere and limits Second Amendment rights. Now, I will concede that the version of the bill that moved through the Senate didn't have many of the gun ban provisions that the president originally talked about, but we've gotten to the point with this bill. I mean, they were talking about excluding certain rural communities and trying to cobble together enough votes that rather than look for some cobbled together flag they can wave that has makes very little difference in the way we're able to enforce and go after the criminals that commit these crimes, let's focus on the topics that can make a difference, topics like a national dialogue on mental health, because none of us want to see the genuinely mental ill receive guns. We can focus on school security and try to figure out ways that we can keep our young people in schools safer and try to move away from, this seems to have deteriorated to the point that all the president's trying to get is a symbolic victory, not really any change in substance.
But it's so watered down. Would he be getting much of a victory? I mean, you said it.
Well, that's kind of my point, is that, the Second Amendment is an important fundamental principle of liberty. It's the Second Amendment.
Right.
And so we want to make sure it's protected. We ought to only be moving in that area where we know we're making a difference and where we're focused on those, the criminal and the mentally ill that shouldn't have guns. And one of the things I've said throughout this process as well is what's the hurry? I mean, we've seen with the Obamacare debate, the way that bill was rushed through. Now, years later, we're continuing to see all kinds of complications. If this is an important enough principle, it can make its way through the legislative process.
Can any gun control measures make it through Congress, do you think?
I think that the best opportunities we have to make a difference and a real genuine policy difference would be efforts directed at school security, efforts directed at a more comprehensive approach to mental health, and I would like to see us enforce the current background checks we have on the books.
The NRA, of course, no surprise to you, often gets blasted for its power over the Republican vote when it comes to something like this. In fact, the president said the gun lobby lied about some of the facts in this legislation, and that prompted gun owners to intimidate the senators in this case. What is your take on that?
Well, first, when you take your oath to serve, it's an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. It doesn't mention any political party, and it certainly doesn't mention any third-party outside group. But I would tell you this, that the NRA is strong because it represents a set of beliefs that are consistent with the vast majority of Americans, at least that live in my congressional district. I mean, it's a conservative area, and 10 to 1. We have heard people saying they want their Second Amendment rights protected and not limited. When you don't win a debate, it's often easy to go look for excuses and scapegoats, and frankly, I think that's what the president's doing here. All
right, we're going to talk about some more debates. When we come back, we have much more with Congressman Messer, including the debate over same-sex marriage. All right, welcome back to Indianapolis This Week. We are joined again by Congressman Luke Messer, who represents the 6th Congressional District here in Indianapolis. First time in Washington, and things going well for you, I take it?
They are, Todd. We're enjoying it. Obviously, getting started is a transition, but it's been an incredible opportunity.
Very good. Let's talk gay marriage. We expect the Supreme Court will rule on gay marriage as soon as June. What do you expect might come out of that?
Well, it's hard to guess. I've learned long ago to not guess what the Supreme Court will do until they rule. I can tell you, though, out in the 19 counties that I represent, this is not what people are talking about. They're talking about jobs and the economy. They're talking about the Second Amendment. You'll occasionally hear about this, but it's not really top of mind for most folks. I frankly support current law. I think the approach in DOMA that allows states to guide the process of marriage, which is what we've done traditionally in this country over the last couple hundred years, is the right approach. So I hope they uphold the law, but we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Many Republicans, even Democrats, though, have recently changed their stance on gay marriage and moved toward accepting it or supporting it, saying this is really the time that maybe it should happen. You think we're not at that time now or ever?
Well, I support the traditional approach to marriage. I see no reason to change the current law. I think, frankly, we have a strong compromise here. Some states are recognizing it, but they're not. Part of what this debate's about, people need to realize, is that if Massachusetts or California changes their law, if DOMA goes away, Indiana will most likely be required to accept those changes in the law. I think we ought to have a process where individual states are able to establish the parameters of how they define marriage.
Would you support a constitutional amendment in Indiana supporting that?
When I was a state legislator, I did support the constitutional amendment that would define marriages between a man and a woman. I do believe that this is best handled at a state basis, and I do not support a federal constitutional amendment.
You think it's the right move to hold off as an individual state until it's decided in the Supreme Court?
You know, I'm not familiar enough with all the nuances of the state debate. As my understanding is, they're going to vote on it next year, and I'll defer to the speaker and the leader on that.
All right. President Obama released his budget proposal recently. He's proposing $2 in spending cuts for every $1 of new revenue, from restricting tax benefits and cutting down on some tax loopholes. I'm sure you have found some things wrong with this budget. First of all, let's start there. Have you had a chance to really look through it? Do you know what you like, what you don't like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm on the House Budget Committee, and I supported a budget that would balance in 10 years. The president's budget doesn't balance between, depending on your estimate, 25, 30 plus years. He would describe it as $2 in spending cuts for every tax increase. I would tell you many of those savings are sort of accounting gimmicks. Things like counting the end of the Iraq and Afghanistan war presence, which clearly is already going to happen under the law. I'd like to see us take an approach to budgeting far more similar to what we've done in Indiana under Governor Daniels' leadership, where we really froze spending for multiple years, and we're able to reduce spending in many areas. And I think today, 8, 9 years later, we're providing better services in leaner ways. We could do it at the federal government level as well. You know, I thought it was a good sign, though, that the president included entitlement reform as part of the conversation in his budget without making a final decision on any of those specific proposals. I do believe that for us to get our budget balanced in the long run, we've got to take a look at bringing Social Security and Medicare onto paths that will sustain and protect those programs. I wish the president had not tied any conversation about entitlement cuts to further tax increases. I think that, frankly, weakens his plan.
Would you reject any tax increases if he proposes?
Well,
or that he's proposed?
You need to remember, while I wasn't there, I just came in office in January, midnight at the end of this last year, or the very beginning of this year, the president got $600 billion in tax increases. Right now, we're not on a plan that's even one-to-one spending reductions to tax increases, and I think we need to get far more serious about spending reductions before we talk about any further increases in taxes.
All right, we have less than a minute to address an amnesty bill for illegal immigration. A bipartisan group of senators has come up with a bill that they say would grant amnesty to the 11 million illegals out there right now. It seems more people, both Democrats and Republicans and public in general, moving toward accepting some sort of amnesty program. What do you support?
Well, I wouldn't support amnesty. I mean, I think we've got to have a program that recognizes the folks that came here unlawfully don't get a better deal than people who've tried to follow the law. But I do believe this. Our current system is broken. 11 million people are here, and they have de facto amnesty today. Because unless you commit a violent crime, you're not going to be sent home, even if you're here illegally. We need to find a solution that works towards a program where workers have the opportunity to work. And then but I think for that program to be successful, both politically and from a policy perspective, it has to start with a commitment to border security, and it has to recognize that the folks who came here unlawfully can't get a better deal than the people who followed the law.
So would you support any path to citizenship?
I think we need to start with a guest worker program and recognize a commitment to border security, and with those two parameters, I think there's a possibility over time, but frankly, I think it's an open debate.
All right, Congressman Luke Messer, 6th District, safe travels back to Washington.
Great
Thanks
for
coming
being
in.
here.
All right. All right, when we come back, we'll talk more to our political insiders about the week's events in the General Assembly. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to Indianapolis This Week. Time to bring in our RTV6 political insiders. Kip Tu is a former chairman of the Indiana Democratic Party, and Abdul Hakim Shabazz is the publisher of IndyPolitics.org. Gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
Talk a little gun control. The Senate killed the amendment to a bill expanding background checks, an area that really had broad support from both sides. What happened here? Kip?
Well, it had broad support from the public. I don't think it's accurate to say it had broad support from both sides.
It was gaining support, though, wasn't it?
It would have passed. 90% of Democrats voted for it. 90% of Republicans voted against it. We've reached a point in our democracy, I don't understand how it's possible, but everything in the United States Senate requires 60 votes rather than a majority. I think it's a travesty. I don't know how it is we've reached this point. It's certainly not in the Constitution. Constitution says majority rules, but here we are with 60 votes. And I understand, and you're probably going to bring it up, that Harry Reid set the rule on this particular bill such that every amendment that went on it had to have 60 votes, and that's because he didn't want bad amendments to go on it, and I understand that. But, you know, the fact of the matter, to deal with what I think is the merits of the issue, which is should we or should we not expand background checks, and is that an infringement on the Second Amendment? Well, we already have them. So to argue that it's an infringement, we're saying we're closing the gun show loophole, we're closing internet gun sale loophole. So I don't know how it's possible one can argue that that's somehow an infringement on the Second Amendment, because we already have a background check.
Right. I agree with you, Kip, fundamentally. We're talking about closing some of the loopholes. And the fact that my friends who are worried about sort of this camel's nose under the tent when it comes to gun and background checks. I mean, anytime you go to the grocery store, you know, swipe your card, then they print off a coupon for your next purchase, and it was a purchase that you made 2-3 weeks ago. I mean, you're already being tracked, and people are already monitoring your movements, as we're finding out with some of the national events taking place this week. I do think, though, it's a little disingenuous, though, and Kip, you're right, with that kind of, you know, forecast, you should go play the lottery, because you're going to probably win next weekend. When the Democrats make the rules, you can't get upset that people actually follow the rules. And, you know, and if 60 votes is what it took, 60 votes is what it took. Now, the good news is, for Kip's side of things, is that a lot of the Republicans, the more conservative people, they didn't get what they wanted either. So, unfortunately, you know, there is something wrong. We have this sort of paralysis, you know, in Washington, D.C., that nothing can get done because it takes now 60 votes. So maybe we should rethink that filibuster rule, but it works both ways.
This was it seemed to be so watered down from what it originally started at. I mean, would this have been that big of a deal? I mean, it expands the background check somewhat. It doesn't talk about magazines or assault weapons.
Well, there were amendments that were offered on both of those, and they failed as well. So the question that's going to, I think, come in the future is, are they going to come with a clean bill that just does background checks? And I hope that at least they do that. There is no excuse, in my opinion, when you have 90% of the public who support something, that you can't get a bill passed in the United States Congress on it. And as I said before, we are not attacking the Second Amendment in this instance. We're saying if you go to a gun show, you have to pass a background check, just like if you walk into a gun store. If you want to buy a gun on the internet, you have to pass a background check. Because why? We don't want dangerous criminals, and we don't want people who've been got severe mental problems with weapons. Why don't we want that? Because felons are going to use it for nefarious purposes, and they're not supposed to have them anyway. It's already against the law for them to have them, so why would we not have a background check on them in every place?
But here's something to keep in mind about gun shows, and I'm not necessarily a gun enthusiast, so I just want to shoot myself in the foot. Gun shows are actually some of the most safest places to purchase a gun, because they are filled with law enforcement, undercover, you know, local, state,
it still happens.
Local, state, and federal officials. And if you look at some of the most serious gun crimes that have happened in this country, you know, show me one where people went out and purchased them, you know, at gun shows. Usually, it was people who did things sort of above board, or did a straw purchase and got it from the bad guys.
Well, I mean, I think that statistics have shown that the felons now are getting their guns through internet and through gun shows, through second parties. And so it seems to me that if we can cut the flow, we ought to cut the flow. I mean, we're never going to fix it entirely. All of us can agree that we're not going to make the situation 100% great right off the bat. But we can take steps to make things better, so why wouldn't we?
The president came out pretty strongly on this and accused the NRA, the lobbyists, of lying about the legislation and
a lobbyist was less than truthful? Oh, my
Imagine
Lord.
That.
Say it isn't so.
And so gun owners then intimidated the senators and talked them into not voting for it. I mean,
well, they particularly lied about the registry, and I think that's exactly what he was talking about. There's a whole bunch of rumors out there that this was going to create a registry.
In fact, he said it would have outlawed a registry.
That's right. Specifically in the language, it said there would be no registry, and that it would be a felony for someone to try to develop a registry. So they were just flat out lying. He was telling the absolute truth on that. And, you know, the political implications of this, I think, are interesting going forward. And I think that we may have finally reached a point where the NRA is now finally diminishing in their ability to influence elections, because they've gone over the top here.
Any hope for any sort of gun control legislation?
Let me have one more, pardon the pun, one more shot at it, but I will say if nothing gets done maybe a little bit later this summer or early fall, forget about it. Now it becomes a campaign issue in 2014.
And that's the point I was going to make. Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, has decided that he's going to spend a lot of his capital money on this issue, and he's going to start putting money where his mouth is on this issue, and that makes a difference.
He spent a lot of money on it already.
He has. He took out in the Jesse Jackson replacement race up in Chicago. He spent heavily on behalf of one candidate, and that candidate won running away.
We have only like 45 seconds left, but the revenue forecast is out for the state, $200 million more than what we expected. A little more ammunition for Governor Pence and getting his tax cut?
Much more likely for the governor to get a partial tax cut. In my prediction, he probably gets about 5%, and he may get the rest of it. It'll be phased in over the 4-year window.
I think there's a greater chance he's going to get it. I still maintain it's a huge mistake for the state of Indiana.
All right. Kip, Abdul, guys, thanks for joining me as always. Have a good rest of your weekend, and we'll be back right after this. This week, set to be a big one at the State House. The General Assembly is required to wrap up its work by Friday. Of course, our Norman Cox will be there to follow all of those developments for you. And you can get those updates online on our mobile apps and, of course, each day right here on RTV6. And thank you for joining us for this edition of Indianapolis This Week. And don't forget, the Indiana Pacers begin their playoff run this afternoon at Bankers Life Fieldhouse. The game begins at 1 p.m. We'll have full reaction tonight at 6 here on RTV6. And for all of us here at RTV6, I'm Todd Connor. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you for choosing RTV6 News. Always stay connected with the IndyChannel.com and RTV6 apps for your mobile devices.